This week, the C-SPAN school bus makes a number of stops in New Jersey and New York. This morning, the bus will be at Pinelands Regional High School in Toms River, New Jersey. In the afternoon, the bus will stop in Point Pleasant Beach, where 8th grade students from Antrim School will have a chance to visit with the crew. Now a look at what's ahead on our program schedule. Next, a live viewer call-in program with William Greider and P.J. O'Rourke of Rolling Stone magazine. In this 90-minute program, our guest will take your comments and phone calls and talk about the latest headline news stories. At 10, live coverage of a House Judiciary Subcommittee hearing looking at the issue of whether assault weapons should be banned. And at 12, live gavel-to-gavel coverage of today's pro forma session of the U.S. House of Representatives. This evening at 9, we'll bring you live coverage of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's speech to a political action group that raises funds for Republican candidates. And that's some of what's ahead on C-SPAN. Now, our live viewer call-in program with William Greider and P.J. O'Rourke of Rolling Stone magazine.
Bill Greider, national editor of Rolling Stone magazine. As we begin another week, last week in April, what do you think Rolling Stone readers would be interested in this morning on the front pages?
I think they're probably still obsessing on the death of Kurt Cobain, and they're not ready for Nixon. A big chunk of them...
I don't remember Nixon.
A big chunk of them, this is one of the wonderful things about the readers of Rolling Stone, actually, is they were either born or they were 2 years old, many of them not yet born, at the time the rest of us were fixating on Richard Nixon's crimes. And so you sort of have to start with that understanding, and there's no reason why they should be fixated by them.
I do not feel like I'm a real old guy. I mean, I'll be 47 this year. Thanks. Watergate is to them.
How old?
47.
That's kind of old to be writing for Rolling Stone.
Hey, you're telling me this? But, I mean, Watergate is to them, to the older Rolling Stone readers, as Korea is to, as the war in Korea is to me, not the current Korea, but...
Why do you write for Rolling Stone magazine?
Money. They pay.
And you've got it. I've got an earlier issue here. This was from the last part of April, and there's a piece on here about Haiti. You think they'll read it?
Yes, actually. We were just talking about this before we show went on, is that Bill and I, who do not fit into the Rolling Stone picture very well, and you can just look at us. I mean, obviously not.
You speak for yourself there.
Oh, yeah, she has a secret life we little know about. And goes home, fires up that bong, listens to Smashing Pumpkins or whatever they're called. And but we get recognized by, whenever they do the surveys, the kids say, "Oh yeah, it was more Greider, it was more," and I think they're lying. But they do know our name.
They know that's the responsible call in an opinion survey of the readership.
Yes, that's the one that makes you...
They read the heavy stuff.
That's right? The answer that makes you feel better about yourself.
You, in this same issue, you have a piece on the best little sinecure in Washington. It's all about the Federal Elections Commission.
That's Frank Wilkinson's piece, but not mine. But
sorry, it's right next to your piece. Close enough for Rolling Stone.
That's right.
But you have a piece here on why the mighty GE can't strike out.
Yeah, this is a just...
But it's always politics.
It's just a quick take on our president and the political community's solution to the crime problem. 3 strikes, you're out. And I suggest, if that's a good idea, and I don't think it is, why not apply it to corporate criminals? And you start with the list of defense contractors, General Electric, General Dynamics, go down the list.
Talk about recidivists.
Almost all of them, all of the biggies have defrauded the federal government and taxpayers at least 3 times, many of them more often, just in the last 10 years. And what happens to them is they get a little slap on the wrist and a lecture from the Justice Department, and they have to sign a piece of paper that promises they'll never do it again.
Never do that particular kind of cheating.
That kind of cheating again. And then they go back to the well of taxpayer money and do it all over again. So if I were a street criminal about to get put away for life for doing 3 muggings, I would say this is the clearest example possible of the unequal justice in our country.
This piece, though, by Frank Wilkinson about the Federal Election Commission talks about how 2 commissioners were reappointed after spending already a couple of terms on the commission. Why would your audience be interested in something like that?
They ought to be interested in it. I think that's the standard more than we don't go at it the other way around. I mean, why are they interested in Haiti? Because they ought to be interested in Haiti or whatever. But I think the deeper answer is that's a good, tough piece about the reality of campaign money and how neither political party really cares to do much about it. And I'd say Rolling Stone readers, a big chunk of them at least, are intensely interested.
Here's the front page of the Washington Post, and there are 2 stories. The lead story is here: Serbs heed threat, shift heavy guns, and if you go across the paper, bombs kill 9 in South Africa as voting nears. What do you think of those?
South Africa is actually a Rolling Stone issue in the sense you're asking, Brian, and the reason is that a generation of young people were educated on South Africa going back 10, 15 years by rock stars.
Oddly enough, yes.
Yeah, and I wrote about this in my last book. That the rap on young people is that they are apathetic, indifferent, ignorant, etc. And in many ways, those are all true. But nobody ever talks to them in a way that says, here's why you ought to care about this. Instead, you watch the evening news, which is mostly graying old heads going blah, blah, blah about people they don't know. They have no reason why they should care about those people, etc. Then you come along with the world tour of Sting and U2 and some others saying, here's why you should care about human rights in South Africa. And the Amnesty International did this tour, and they were handing out all over the world copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's a very educational act.
It's also one of the great clear moral issues of their lifespan. I mean, many of the moral issues, including, I would say, a lot of the ecological stuff, is morally complex. South Africa is not morally complex. It's been the great educational tool, not only by rock bands, but in general, of here's right and wrong, where we don't need to fudge the issue.
Let me go back to Kurt Cobain and see if there's a relationship.
Boy, do we know nothing about this.
I wouldn't say.
All right, first, who was he? How old was he? You know?
12.
He was 27.
27.
And he was the leader, creative writer, singer with Nirvana, which became in what, the 91,
right,
probably the hottest band in America. Seattle grunge world. And
sold 10 or 11 million copies of their key album.
I mean, the reason it's important, and I mean that quite sincerely, is it's a regeneration of rock and roll in new, you know, a lot like the old rock and roll from the 60s, but with a much darker
This is the
lining, don't you think?
This is the interesting part about it. Musically, I cannot tell it apart from sort of off-brand Bachman-Turner overdrive. I mean, to me, all of this grunge rock sounds like regurgitated sort of Led Zeppelin on a bad day. You know, it doesn't sound strange to me. It sounds, if anything, all too familiar. But that aside, what's puzzling and interesting to me is the extremely dark side to all this. The life's not worth living, which Kurt seems to have taken it in hand to attempt to prove personally. You know, everything's awful. I hate my mother. You know, I'm not quite sure what this is about.
But the heavies in this town, Washington, D.C., would do well to spend a little time on MTV. I mean, it tends to be a kind of mockery of the MTV mentality, not totally unearned. But there is something. They are saying something about the culture, which means something about the state of
Actually,
politics.
I think they should watch it a bit. I'm not sure if they should go on it.
No, don't go on it. But turn up the sound and listen to the lyrics.
Yeah.
Well, what I really want to ask was, is there any relationship with the way these kids feel about the death of Kurt Cobain, or what he had to say about life and his music, to the Nixon presidency, the Watergate, the scandal? You pick up the papers this morning. Here's the front page of the Los Angeles Times, and the headline is "Nixon Opened Gate on Scandal and Scrutiny." This Ronald Brownstein's piece starts off with a passion for history. Richard Nixon undoubtedly would have appreciated the irony on the last day of former president's life. Hillary Rodham Clinton sat in the state dining room at the White House fielding the most intimate and pointed questions any first lady had ever faced from reporters.
Intimate and pointed in a real softball, and intimate pointed whiffle questions. I mean,
that's a good question. Here's my leap of fantasy to connect those two. The reason Nixon was so, I mean, he was a Promethean character, and as people are now observing, in every dimension. But he also crystallized the kind of corruption of power surrounding the modern presidency. And I say that having written at the time as a reporter for the Washington Post that the crimes of Nixon did not originate on his watch. They had in fact accumulated through a number of presidents, Democratic and Republican. But he's the guy who pulled it all together for us in one flash moment. And that, I think, was part of the disillusionment that 25 years later leads to Kurt Cobain. I mean, and that's a little fancy, but it's really a sense of
absolutely right.
What may we believe in? In the 60s, the rock and roll still had a very positive sort of undercurrent of if we can just get the right folks in charge, we can assert our values, etc.
And failing that, we'll have sex.
In the meantime, we will have sex.
In the meantime, we'll have sex.
And I think Kurt Cobain's followers probably don't believe that, and probably never did in their lives.
All right, explain this. You mentioned MTV. Bill Clinton went on MTV last week. You pick up the front page of the New York Times today, and here's this. R.W. Apple, for Clinton and Nixon, a rarefied bond. What's the bond?
Let PJ knock that one out of the park.
Well, both do quite a bit of lying, don't they? Or, well, one of them doesn't anymore. But back to the Kurt Cobain thing for 1 second. I do think that Watergate was there has been an increase in distrust of institutions. People do not believe in a lot of our institutions, religious institutions, social institutions, and of course political institutions. And if you were going to look at the beginning of the end of trust in political institutions in the United States, Watergate would have to figure, Vietnam would figure too, but Watergate would have to figure large in your calculation of that effect.
Well, this piece by Johnny Apple says one was in the 80s, in his 80s, one was in the 40s, one a Republican, the other a Democrat, one was a straight arrow, painfully shy, classic loner, conspicuously formal in dress and manner, though under pressure, as Watergate's tape showed, he could swear like a stevedore. The other, a devotee of Elvis and the Beatles. We haven't gotten to Kurt Cobain yet. Gregarious to a fault, experimented with marijuana in his youth, developed a reputation as a ladies' man, and much prefers sweats to suits. I mean, how do the Rolling Stone readers, I'm not sure, what's the age?
I'll tell you, the Rolling Stone readers, PJ may have a different impression, are wildly divided on the subject of Bill Clinton. They in a broad collective sense, voted in '92 in heavier numbers than they had young people had voted in 25 years. Many of them really are pulling for Bill Clinton. And there's another chunk that really despise him, and it's almost as large, I would guess. And I don't know what your mail is like. My mail has been, probably in the last year and a half, as intense and ugly as any time in the... And half the people, if I raise a hand of criticism on Clinton, they jump me because I'm demanding too much or give the guy a break. And the other half says, "You jerk, we told you he was a bum, and now you're beginning."
Although they didn't tell us he was a bum, I would say going into this administration that our readers, and it is a very broad base, but our core readers are probably end of high school through middle 20s. Is the real core. Speaking to those people, I would say that they were essentially in favor of Clinton, especially by the time Pat Buchanan got done at the Republican convention. I would say they voted for Clinton.
Both of our guests, by the way, are from Ohio originally. What does that mean?
It's the soul of America.
But one's from
someplace everyone leaves.
People do tend to leave.
Ooh,
that's not.
You're going to call shortly.
I'm going to Ohio to visit my mother on Friday.
So. Where does your mother live?
Cincinnati.
You grew up in Wyoming, Ohio?
Yeah, it's a suburb of Cincinnati.
Southern Ohio, and you grew up in Northern Ohio, in
Toledo, Ohio. Yep.
Could you both explain your current politics?
You first.
Well, it's a long, long story. There's nothing more Republican in America than Southern Ohio. Cincinnati, I grew up in the shadow of the Tafts, etc. I got an education really mainly as a newspaper reporter into the broader and more complicated realities of our society than one gets in a Republican suburb, a lovely place to grow up. And I just found the rest of the country more interesting than the Republican image of, say, the late 1950s. My father, and I've written over 20 years a number of mildly controversial things, and my reporter from one of the Cincinnati newspapers called up my father once and said, you know, your son is ragging on Ronald Reagan. How do you feel about that? And my father said, well, Bill's always been kind of liberal, but he's not a fool about it. And I always thought that was the nicest thing my dad could say in my behalf in those circumstances.
You want to take a shot at Mr. O'Rourke?
I'm troglodyte.
He came the other way.
Well, not really. I was born and raised.
Winger?
Born and raised, serious Republican. Not exactly a hard right-winger, but a Taft Republican. My grandmother, who was very political and who was a formative influence in my life, couldn't bear Richard Nixon, for instance. Could barely bear Eisenhower. She considered Taft to be the right
That's the hardcore. People have forgotten that. And you mentioned Buchanan, but Buchanan is speaking for that old hardcore isolationist Republican sort of.
Well, my grandmother would have pointed out he was Catholic.
That's a contradiction he has to get over. That's true.
We don't quite approve. You know, they rent.
Pat Buchanan is a wannabe Midwestern Protestant.
Mr. Greider went to Princeton. Mr.
Two-toilet Irish, we call them. A toilet upstairs, a toilet downstairs.
Mr. O'Rourke went to Miami of
Ohio.
Yes. And also
not the one on water ski.
Now, Miami of Ohio, when I was growing up, I'm sure this wasn't true in your case, was the party school. That was where...
It was true in my case.
It's not anymore, I gather. I mean, it's gotten much more serious.
Well, you know, they moved the drinking age up to 21. I wouldn't say they were more serious. I'd just say they were sneakier.
More surreptitious.
Yes. Here's the lead in the editorial in the Wall Street Journal. When Mr. Nixon died late Friday, both USA Today and Wall Street Journal had no weekend edition, so they're dealing with it today. Richard Milhouse Nixon was one of the most intriguing public figures of our era. Often in life depicted as a cardboard villain, in death, he is being celebrated even by many of his sometime detractors. Have you both been listening to the talk, and what do you think of this?
But I don't think either of us have been celebrating.
No. I mean, he was Nixon was a great politician in the sort of amoral meaning of that phrase. That he had, as I said, Promethean appetites and abilities. And at the core of that, unfortunately, was this sort of deep sense of injury and malice. And I, you know, you mentioned Bill Clinton. I've pondered there is a kind of resonance between those two figures. I don't think Clinton has that kernel of malice. On the other hand, Clinton came from similar origins, a kind of lower middle class, shabby. Poverty. I mean, not quite poverty, but not quite. And a desire, a very strong desire, to be accepted among the big guys of America. And Nixon had that too. And at the same time, in Nixon, and I concede that this was not widely acknowledged at the time, he also, like Clinton, had a real sense of caring about those people whom. At that level, I mean, and you look at the actual record of his presidency rather than the rhetoric. All of the Great Society programs soared in his presidency, and he didn't step on them. He spent
as a conservative, one of the reasons I don't like him.
He had some proposals for welfare reform and some other things that were as progressive as anything the libs were throwing up.
One of those who was quite specific in his feelings about Richard M. Nixon was Paul Conrad of the Los Angeles Times, the cartoonist. Yes. I mean, for those who don't see Mr. Conrad, there was some very, strong stuff. I just wondered, this is what he's doing this morning. You're an observer of things like this. What's he trying to say?
What he's trying to say is he's really sorry that particular target for his beanbags is gone. That's what he's trying to say.
He'll find another.
Yeah, he'll find another.
I mean, look, America doesn't beat up on the dead. We'll reflect on Nixon for a lot of years, and it'll be slightly less mellow, I would predict, than it is this morning. But,
but I had an interesting. Last night. I was having dinner with Andy Ferguson, who's been on this show a number of times.
Used to write for
American Spectator, still does sometimes. Is a writer for the Washingtonian now, senior writer for Washingtonian, and a wise man. And I said, what was good about Nixon? Why should we care about Nixon? I mean, I know why we should be mad at him, but what was good about him? International politics aside, that's another big question. But domestically, I didn't agree with him. And then we have the various moral problems and anger and so on. And Andy said he was talking to a Reagan speechwriter friend of his who was an enormous admirer of Nixon, even though being a very, very rock-ribbed conservative. And Andy once asked this guy, said, why do you like Nixon? And Nixon was not, as a president, he was not a conservative. He really doesn't seem to fit your political profile. Why are you so fond of this guy? And the guy, the Reagan speechwriter, said, Nixon hated the right people was why he liked him. And I think, looking back on it, maybe that's why I like Nixon, too. He hated the right people.
Yeah, and I would observe that that's the deformity of the right in this country.
The hatred?
Yeah. I mean, that's what, I mean, not exclusively, of course, but to a very large degree, that's what fuels the right in America.
Well, it certainly does get us up in the morning, but I must say that anybody who really...
That's what brings out the money, you know, these newsletters.
And the fun. And the fun.
Some fun. Some fun.
Anybody who really, really hated the Kennedys cannot have been all bad, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, draw him out a little more on this. It's going to get real ugly in a minute. Who else do you hate, PJ?
Yeah. I would say, no, we'll just leave it at the Kennedys. I mean, there's a whole raft of striped pants, cookie pushers out there, you know. But Nixon's hatred of the East Coast establishment, I think, was a point well taken, at least in the way that the East Coast establishment acted from the end of World War II until the end of the war in Vietnam.
You know, that's a good example. The trouble with the right is that that's a pose. Nixon was a lawyer at Nixon Mudge Rose in New York. He was as much of the East Coast establishment as anywhere else.
And of course, he wound up, you know, living out there in Saddle Hills or
I mean, this is
short shoes or whatever it's called.
I mean, we could go into Nixon hypocrisies for the rest of the morning, but conservatives generally
he never quit hating
want to have it both ways. They want to be the power center in America, which on the whole they are, and at the same time they're just folks in the street railing at the establishment.
What does it mean? Time magazine does an analysis of their covers. 56 times he was on the cover. More than anybody in history of the magazine.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. But Ronald Reagan was on 44 times, and Herbert Hoover's the only president since the magazine was created who did not make the cover.
I must say, Time as Usual was wrong. Herbert Hoover was actually a pretty decent guy. And Nixon, as we know, was not particularly. I mean, you know, if you take the moral proportions.
Nixon was around a long time. That's why it was on the cover of Time. So
this is really a change of subjects, and we'll be going to the phones in just a moment. There's a front page story in the Philadelphia Inquirer this morning, and the headline is "Talk Radio Spews Forth New Candidates." Subhead: At least 9 hosts are running, and they come with ready-made followings. And one of them is Rona Romney, who's running for the Senate in Michigan. What do you think?
I am not familiar with her, I must say. I am familiar with Howard Stern, and I think that that the governorship of New York deserves no better. Were I a registered New York voter, I would drop my dime on him in a minute.
Well, Steve Goldstein of the Inquirer says here that all are running, didn't mention Howard Stern, are Republicans. And that a lot of this has to do with...
A couple of them are in Florida.
Yeah. Radio hosts are in communication every day with people and tend to go out and vote, said talkmeister Larry King, who parlayed the genre into an influential television interview show. They represent anger, they have strong opinions and the gift of gab, and they are known to lots of people. What do you think of the idea of talk show hosts becoming...
Well, I don't know that. I think it's an elaboration on what we've already had, which is, you know, Jesse Helms got to political prominence as a TV commentator, not as a politician, and that was his first base. And I think there are a bunch of people in the Congress with that background, aren't there? That
some kind of stump background.
Yeah,
you know.
And Bob Dornan was a TV guy, and there's a couple other House members like that.
Well, there's another one here. Manhasset, New York is the place, the venue, and the man is Bill O'Reilly, who is an anchor on Inside Edition, and he's thinking of running for Congress. As a Republican,
he's got a demographic problem, which is that his audience is all over the country, but it's not in that district. I don't know whether that helps him or hurts him.
Here's what he says. It's time to downsize government. Less government is better. Bill O'Reilly.
Well, he's certainly right, but why doesn't he start right at home with downsizing by staying out of it?
Why?
It's my technique.
Did you ever think about running?
Never. I inhaled. Worse than inhaled. I was down on all fours in a shag carpet. No, never mind. But
never make the cut.
I had way too much fun. Way too much fun.
But the younger generation that your magazine does it represent? What's the age group of readers?
The average age of Rolling Stone is like 26 now.
Something like that. Yeah.
And how about a cover story like this, which is on the stands as we speak? Drugs in America.
Well, you'll notice if you read through that Rolling Stone's not in favor of drugs. Maybe in favor of legalization or decriminalization.
Yeah,
but, you know,
that's actually, I had nothing to do with it, so I can say that's a very impressive piece of work. It's a very serious. I would recommend it to people who loathe Rolling Stone to sit down and read through a very careful and serious description of the drug war in America, the social decay that's falling out of it.
More important than people who loathe Rolling Stone, people who think Rolling Stone is trivial. I mean, we get to kid about it, but I mean, Rolling Stone is, to a remarkable degree, a content-driven magazine. I mean, of course, it covers the silliness that it was founded upon, as well it should. It is its job. But not many magazines would take time out to devote an entire issue to, and I think there's some painfully unpopular positions taken in here, and some pretty courageous thinking about what is obviously a real legal.
Ethan, is it Nadelman?
Yeah, from Princeton. Yeah,
and Jan Wenner, who's your owner. Editorializer.
Yeah, Ethan Nadelman is a professor at Princeton and has been for many years one of the serious advocates of reform, and as he gets there from a social and pharmacological viewpoint more than political.
Here's U.S. News. Let me go back to this subject one more time and relate it to your magazine and what the 26-year-olds think about when they. I don't know if you've had this opportunity the last couple of days, when they sit around and listen to all of us talk about Richard Nixon, what do you think, what do they think about him?
Well, I think that they're, as when we're sitting around talking about most things, they're bored. You know? I don't think he's a major player, and he just doesn't loom large. He was an elder statesman by the time that they were aware. And you know how interesting elder statesmen are, except to the rest of us who are verging on it.
They may, you know, when you think about it in their terms, they may have a kind of photographic memory of Watergate, resignation, impeachment, that's really a TV image and not much more than that.
Sort of like the same image they have of Vietnam as the helicopter leaving the roof.
Yeah, like that. They were 5, 6 years old if you were 26.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to another question then that we talked about earlier. Why are they... Let me read a subhead. More than 300,000 Americans are behind bars for drug offenses. 1 in 5 federal prisoners are first-time petty offenders. We spend $20 billion a year for enforcement, but illegal drugs are more available than ever. What's the drug thing about? Why do they...
Well, they go to jail. You see, one of the great injustices, middle-class injustices, God knows there are injustices aplenty for the poorer people. But one of the great middle-class injustices going on at the moment is silly little kids at Grateful Dead concerts. I keep trying to point out to the kids they weren't any good back then. They're not any good now.
You're so wrong about that. It's amazing.
But at any rate...
that is not an official Rolling Stone
No,
position.
It certainly is not an official, by any means. No, it's an official PJ position.
You were wrong then, and you're wrong now.
They're a second-rate band. Anyway, all these kids out in the parking lot of these Grateful Dead concerts selling each other harmless bits of mind-addling junk that they'll all get over in about 3 minutes. and so watered down LSD, and they're being arrested, and they are being sent to jail for a long time. And we've got kids out there who are in jail for 10 years for having, first place, LSD that would hardly have passed muster in my day. It wouldn't have made the wallpaper look interesting.
Let me show you a fax. This is fax day here. You all can see that. What do you think? Can you read it?
Well, I quarrel with the left-hand list.
Why?
Well, we didn't have domestic peace in the USA. I mean, you have to not remember what that period was like.
I don't think we had
imagine.
détente with the Soviet
Withdrawal
Union,
from Vietnam took him 5 years and another 10 or 15,000 lives, American lives, not to mention Indo-Chinese lives. I mean, we could go back in a hardball way and re-argue Nixon's record. I think the nicest thing you can say about him is that he was a tragic misuse of great talent.
Brilliant man. Absolutely.
Yeah, no,
best political handicapper.
No argument about that.
Here's USA Today's headline on their editorial this morning: Richard Nixon, an enigma even in death. Both of our guests have written lots of books. P.J. O'Rourke, where are you on the book list? Do you got another one?
Finishing up my 7th, I guess.
What's it going to be about?
This is called All the Trouble in the World, and it's the lighter side of overpopulation, famine, plague, ecological disaster, and your minority hatred.
Your book writing.
I'm working the same territory, actually, from a somewhat different angle. No, I'm working on a book about the global economy, trying to make sense of it.
Is there a co-author of this? David Broder's working on it, but I think was he working with you or somebody else?
No.
I got that wrong. Twice.
All right.
2-0 this morning. Anyway, time for the phones. Our guests, William Greider and P.J. O'Rourke of Rolling Stone magazine. First call, we go to Boynton Beach, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to talk about the death of Kurt Cobain. I think it's been trivialized in terms. I've heard Rush Limbaugh, for example, call him human debris. And I've heard people kind of gloss over the fact that what we're really talking about, I think, is severe depression, adolescent depression, young adult depression, which very often can lead to suicide. And I don't think we play up the seriousness of what happened. I think Rolling Stone is in a position to reach a lot of kids, in the area of depression and suicide, and do an article to alert them to some of the signs and symptoms.
Caller, does it have anything to do with society at large, or is this strictly a mind problem with Kurt Cobain, in your opinion?
I think he's just one of the many kids that commit suicide. I think to relate it to the breakdown in institutions or whatever is far too simple an explanation. I mean, I don't think we talked about that when Hendrix killed himself and Janis Joplin killed themselves, or when Charlie Bird Parker overdosed. I mean, I just think this comes with the territory with a subset of adolescents and young adults.
Thanks.
Well, sure, on some level, it's always personal. I basically agree with what you're saying about the larger problem, and I think there is a social context for it because adolescent depression and suicide have been rising rather dramatically in the last 10, 20 years.
So is the suicide of old people, as a matter of fact. Men over the age of 65 have the highest rate, and the rate has been increasing at the highest rate.
Hollywood, Florida, you're next.
Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
I got a couple of questions, but first of all, I was amused to hear Clinton toadies call in yesterday during the Sunday Journal on Nixon's death and hear them launch their spitballs at the Clinton cover-up and the horrors of Richard Nixon. I'm bewildered because there's a massive cover-up going on right now. The White House is squashing any hearings on Whitewater, and even Bob Dole has wimped out, and this cover-up includes not just the White House, but the entire Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill. I would like to ask the panelists there why it is, seeing that Clinton kept an SNL open to help a big campaign fundraiser buddy in business of his that ultimately cost taxpayers $72 million, that he strong-armed Judge David Hale to extend an illegal $300,000 loan to help Whitewater. And undoubtedly, Clinton had a hand in the total destruction of all of the state campaign records for the 1984 gubernatorial race. Apparently, this was done to hide the identity of possibly ghost contributors through whom McDougal funneled Madison funds to Clinton prior to Madison's collapse.
Whoa. Rush Limbaugh overdose. I mean, listen, nobody can take anything away from me in the loathing Clinton department. I truly can't stand the man.
You've changed on that score. You once
No, I
liked
think
this
he's
guy
personally likable. I think he's personally likable, but as a politician, as a president, I detest him, detest his policies. But I do not think there's a cover-up about Whitewater. I think that news organizations are putting adequate or even more than adequate resources into investigating this, and I think there probably is plenty of dirt there, and I think it will all come out. I don't think there's going to be any huge smoking gun or any enormous felony, but I think that there's a lot of dirty little Arkansas politics, and by the time it's over, we'll know more about it than we ever cared to learn.
I don't disagree with that. That there's and I don't give the Clintons a clean bill of health on the facts so far. Let's find out what the facts are. But why have the right wing? I mean, it seems to me the right wing is really frothing on this.
Any stick will do to beat a dog, is what it comes down to.
But does that suggest there aren't any other good sticks? I mean, it seems
actually it does suggest a certain lack of creativity. I would much rather whack Clinton with the tree limb of Bosnia policy than with the mere Louisville slugger of whatever went on in Arkansas. Personally,
Merced, California. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like to address this to Mr. Greider. He made a statement a little while ago about the hypocrisy right, Nixon coming down and mixing with the common people once in a while. But I think that applies on both ways. How many of the movie people, the politicians, and everything come out of their mansions and their estates and stand in a line in a mission handing out food to the homeless once a year, and then go back to their estates? I mean, there seems to be a lot of hypocrisy that go both ways. The French have a saying that I think applies here. It's in French. I don't know how it goes, but it translates: "Think left, live right." Maybe you can address that.
Thanks.
That's nice. I like that. There's I think and I can't remember who said it. Balzac or Colonel Dreyfus or somebody, that you be bourgeois in your personal life so you can be radical in your politics, and I like that. It's the same thing. Actually, I agree with you completely. And I think probably PJ does too. That the disillusionment is utterly bipartisan and across the spectrum ideologically. I mean, my last book was all about the distance between people in general and people who are in the governing elites and
other elites,
and business elites and academic, absolutely, and that's what people feel. They know that separation is real. They didn't invent that. They didn't imagine it, and it gets expressed through Rush Limbaugh or right-wing frothing or left-wing frothing or enviro frothing.
Or in the case of Kurt Cobain, by blowing your head off with a shotgun.
Well, or disparaging.
Slightly extreme.
Yeah, different kinds. But that's a profound problem for this country. And
back to Kurt for just 1 second. I think that I really think we should be careful about making a 27-year-old, which is like no child in the first place, 27-year-old heroin addict with a lot of personal problems into much of a symbol of anything except 27-year-old heroin addicts with personal problems.
But I was asking from the standpoint of the people that follow him.
Yes.
Now the outpouring of these.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And that caller said that it was disparaged. He's right about that. I mean, not universally, but I read a couple of columns sort of scolding Kurt Cobain for being Kurt Cobain. Well, that's very reminiscent of the sort of established view of how people are supposed to behave and how they react to anybody who's a bit different.
Philadelphia, thanks for waiting. Hello, Philadelphia, you're on the air. Hi.
Hi. I'm calling in terms of your earlier comments about the Hillary Clinton press conference and remarks she made in terms of Vincent Foster, in terms of suicide. She talked to Tipper Gore about that, mental health, and she had formerly mentioned reading William Styron's book. And I'd like to point out to you that, I'm sure you are very well aware of allegations involving Mrs. Clinton and Vince Foster. And if those allegations are true, that there was a relationship between them, it would have certainly put the White House at risk in terms of security, national security risk. Because
why?
Intelligence forces, foreign intelligence would have played Vince Foster. They would have gone directly after him.
You've been watching TV, reading newspapers. It's becoming increasingly clear there's no such thing as foreign intelligence.
Savannah, Georgia. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a comment and a question. First about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon's worst crime wasn't Watergate. It was the fact that 20,000 American servicemen were killed on his watch. And for a peace agreement we got in 1973 that was only slightly better than one we could have gotten in 1969.
Couldn't have said it.
How old are you, caller?
Absolutely.
I'm 39.
Okay.
And I have a question for P.J. O'Rourke on a slightly lighter note. I'd like to ask him, I know you're a world traveler, what you think about this situation in Singapore with this 18-year-old boy, Michael Fay, is going to get flogged?
That's a good question.
Well, I think, and a very interesting one. I think that people have been running their flag up the wrong flagpole here. I'm not, the flogging itself, while it's not something I would recommend or think is cute, is not so important to me as the Singapore system of justice. What worries me about Michael Fay is not that he's likely to get flogged, but that he's likely to be innocent. I mean, I don't think that he did not get anywhere near a fair trial. And I would have been much happier with President Clinton if instead of concentrating on whether flogging is or is not a terrible thing, if Clinton had said, I detest the idea of an American citizen being put through a legal system where there is no right to counsel, where there is no due process of law, where there is in fact not a rule of law but a rule of men. This I do not like at all. And this is the thing that I find most serious in a larger sense. And I do not want to see some kid suffer a brutal punishment under those circumstances. This is a separate question from whether I want to see some kids suffer brutal punishment every now and then.
Are you for caning in the U.S.?
No, I am for making them wear Beatle haircuts and tight blue jeans and listen to Vic Damone. I am for humiliating.
That's the way we grew up, right?
And see, look at us. We turned out okay. I am for humiliating them, but not with martial arts.
Do you all have children?
Yes.
And how old are they?
I have two kids who are both in their late 20s, living in New York.
Do they read Rolling Stone?
Yeah, they do. Not for me.
Just a patronized dad.
Well, my son's a musician, so it's quite relevant to his world.
What kind of a musician?
Plays guitar and jazz, rock and roll, blues.
Children?
Nope.
Hip hop.
No children, no wives, no children.
San Diego, go ahead, please.
Morning, Brian. Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
Good morning.
Big fan of yours, Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you.
Thought that your piece in the American Spectator about the Clintons' enemy list was the funniest thing I've ever read. I'm turning to the American Spectator of September '93, where your 100 Reasons Why Jimmy Carter was a better president than Bill Clinton.
Now, that was fun to write.
Number 43, the FBI didn't kill anybody at Jonestown. Is that a reference to what actually occurred in Waco?
Yes.
And don't you think that we should have an independent investigation into this mass murder?
Well, I don't think that Waco was as well investigated as it might have been, and I continue to be upset about Waco. I don't think there was probably any huge cover-up there. I think there was enormous incompetence of the U.S. government, and I also feel that basically these people were shot for being religious nuts with guns when this country was founded by religious nuts with guns. That's what the Pilgrims were, religious nuts with guns. And you know that very interesting, one of the American Spectator writers came up with a very interesting little factlet, that the number of guns in the Waco compound divided by the number of people there was the same, the ratio was smaller than the rest of Texas.
Well, and they bought those guns at Sunday gun auctions, which are held all over Texas.
Bought them fair and square.
No, I agree with that there's a really important issue of religious freedom involved in that, and then I gather they're not going to do it, but they could start by just dismantling that agency that has really run around the West seeking out bizarre eccentrics who are holed up in mountain retreats with guns, and then demanding entry, and then not surprisingly, gunfire follows.
And this it was a little pragmatic thing here. In the wake of the famous Dog Day Afternoon case in New York in 1971 or 70, whenever it was, this bank robbery and hostages, some hostages were shot. New York City Police Department came up with a hostage negotiating team, and since the early 70s, they have not lost a single person.
Right?
Yeah, and all they do is they just get on the phone and they talk to the nuts, and they just keep them on the phone, and they just talk forever. Talk them out.
A couple quick faxes. Dear Mr. O'Rourke, this comes from Southpaw Joe, the king of ice and snow, Buffalo, New York, says, "Watch the skies." That's one of his salutations. Do you think Richard Nixon is hanging out with L. Ron Hubbard, since both gentlemen just wanted to make things perfectly clear?
It's one of those mysteries that I hope not to have cleared up for me anytime too soon.
You'll know someday.
I'll know someday.
Arlene Talixson of Scottsdale, Arizona. Is it true that in federal offices the framed pictures of the president and vice president have changed, where it is now the president and Hillary, not the vice president? Either one of you know that, Mr. Greider?
No, but I don't know that. I don't think
no,
so.
That's not true, but the picture of Gore does have an eerie glow.
A couple quick ones here. Linda Flannelly, I believe it is, or Flannelly, a PhD from New Haven, Connecticut, maybe at Yale. Why did you cut off, dear C-SPAN, why did you cut off without comment the caller who pointed out Nixon's destructive side? I am usually grateful to you guys for showing all sides. Since Nixon died, I keep hearing about what a great guy he turned out to be. This is a dangerous attitude for Americans. We made the mistake of dumping Nixon over Watergate at the time, rather than examine his secret wars, consider the possibility that he prolonged the end of the war in Southeast Asia until after the 1972 election. This was, we had a show here yesterday morning.
But I agree with that. And one of our callers were proclaiming his brilliance in foreign policy. He wasn't brilliant in foreign policy. Not if you lived through that period. He got stuck. This is what makes some of us very nervous about Bosnia. He and Henry the K got stuck on the question of American, quote, credibility, whatever that is. And a lot of young boys died in order to supposedly defend our credibility.
Credibility, which we don't have.
No, it's a non-existent commodity to begin with. Foreign governments will do what they think they can do and get away with against American power or anybody else's power. And Nixon and Kissinger elaborated this sort of nonsense of that they were actually shaping the world by staying in Indochina. 25 years later, it's pretty obvious how wrong that was.
Gaithersburg, Maryland, thanks for waiting.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
Two quick questions. When Watergate broke, do you believe, former President Ford's assertion that Nixon never even knew about the break-in? And do you think once the break-in occurred, do you think there was sort of an invisible government going on where his assistants were pulling the strings and trying to manipulate the situation, and Nixon had no idea what was going on, or was losing grasp or control of his officials? And the second thing was, how do you think his relation to the communist world was at the time? Do you think he had a lasting influence with the start of the nuclear salt talks and things? And I'll listen to the answer. Thank you.
Mr. O'Rourke?
Well, I don't. Let me take the first half and build a second. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he didn't know about Watergate. Fairly trivial. I mean, immensely stupid, but a little too stupid for Nixon, and maybe a little too trivial for his attention. But I don't think that. I mean, he knew about it shortly thereafter, and it certainly did the cover-up. And I don't think anybody was out of control. I mean, I think.
See, Watergate was a perfect fit with his view of the world. That there are people out there ready to do him evil,
well, that's a good point.
And so therefore we have to get them first. Yeah. That was his motivating process, and I think it's perfectly plausible that he and John Mitchell and a couple of others sat around sucking on these rumors about what the Democrats had or what they were going to do.
You might be
and
right.
They said, let's go get them, you know, and it's true he didn't know they were going in on the night of June 17th, maybe, but yeah, he knew it. I think
that could well be. At any rate, the government, Nixon's government was never out of Nixon's control.
No, but the cover-up only makes sense in the Watergate, and I was a reporter covering that. It only makes sense if Nixon had a pretty good idea going in of what the potential damage was.
I defer to...
You were at the Washington Post during Watergate. Yeah. Did you have anything to do with any of the writings or any of the stories?
I covered some of the hearings as sort of the off-lead color writer.
Which reminds me, what did Nixon say? What were Nixon's last words to Bob Woodward? We know Bob was right by his... We're going to have to wait for Bob Woodward's next book to find out.
Is that a joke?
Yes. I hope.
Rest in Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
Comment on Richard Nixon and then a question. I was a senior at Whittier College in California in 1968, and in the papers lately we've been hearing a lot about how Nixon was really the original comeback kid, And I would say that Richard Nixon owes his presidency to one man who's still in prison in California, and that's Sirhan Sirhan, who shot Bobby Kennedy, as we all know, during upon his victory in the California primary. And thinking back to that time, I remember feeling that, having voted for Kennedy, I was thrilled. I figured he was going to be the next president, and if he had gone up against Nixon, most people figured this Kennedy would also beat Richard Nixon, and things would be quite different in our country now. There's a lot of people who feel that way, in my generation anyway.
All right, thanks.
There are a lot of people who feel that that was sort of the moment when everything was lost. I have to say, as a young reporter covering that season,